I think there's a lot of unfortunate circumstances that result from releasing things as part of a franchise. There's a lot of obvious benefits to it, but most of them are not on the user end, really. It's great for marketing. If you can slap the name of something that people already love onto a new product, then there's a way bigger chance that people are going to pay attention to that product if they're fans of the original thing. But then, you don't necessarily always attract people to the product who would appreciate it. If you're releasing something that doesn't really capture what people liked about the original or about the mainline part of the franchise, then you're going to end up with a lot of people consuming the product, but not necessarily a lot of them who appreciate the product. I really have to wonder how much more appreciated games like Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles or The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures and all the other Four Swords games would be if they weren't a part of those franchises, because they probably wouldn't have sold as well. At least they would have had to been marketed a lot better than they were, as opposed to just slapping the name of a franchise on it and shipping it out. But I think that those games really are being sold to a market who would not enjoy them, because Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles has so little in common with other Final Fantasy games, both in terms of how it's played and what kind of story it has and what the general appeal is, that I think it probably was mostly played by people who didn't really want it. And I mean, even then, just the way the game was released, the fact that it was a GameCube game at a time when Final Fantasy was a Sony, dominated franchise. It was a game that played so differently. I don't even think it sold all that well, per se. They've made other games under the Crystal Chronicles label, so I assume it's successful enough. And even then, all the ones under that label are totally different from one another. So even the Crystal Chronicles label is largely unhelpful, because everything they've released under it has been totally different. And that doesn't even get into how the Crystal Chronicles universe is the same one that the Tactics games take place in, which is also the one that Final Fantasy XII takes place in. Such a convoluted mess. And now sometimes you get lucky with this stuff. I mean, if the game is good enough, then it won't matter. Like, Final Fantasy Tactics is widely regarded as a classic game because it's just a really strong game. And so, regardless of people who are Final Fantasy fans who might have been let down by it, the game has sort of survived on its own strengths as something that people cherish. But when you get a game that maybe isn't amazing, it's just good and certain people would like it, but it gets released under that franchise name, it's just going to deter a lot of people who don't care for the franchise as a whole. People who are like, well, I don't really like Final Fantasy, so why would I play a Final Fantasy game? Whereas the Final Fantasy fans are going, what the fuck is this? This isn't Final Fantasy. It's a treacherous push and pull, and this really happens in all mediums, all across the board, even my own videos. There's a reason I divide my content among several channels. When it comes to something like this series you're watching right here, Handfuls of Zen, which is posted on the Digibro After Dark channel, the expectations on this channel are very different from the main one. And if I post this here, it comes off as, wow, a more edited, more intriguing sort of presentation of an After Dark video. It feels exceptional for this channel, whereas on the main channel, it might feel like, wow, a downgrade from what I'm used to, an unscripted, less coherent sort of presentation, one that's not as edited. So even though a lot more people would watch it if it was on the main channel, these videos would probably get 2 to 3 times the views, if not more, if they were posted to the main channel. They would not have the same level of appreciation, at least not the same percentage of it. There'd be a higher percentage of people who are just not interested in it, who are watching it. And that really affects the sort of cultural identity of the product. Even if a game like Crystal Chronicles actually did reach more people who would love it than it might have as an original IP, it nonetheless has been affected by the idea that, like, there's a lot of people out there who've played it who don't like it. More people than there would have been. Instead of, 80 people who love the game having played it, it's 90 people who love the game played it out of 200, and that really affects the way that people talk about the game and how willing people are to discuss it and how it's remembered by the social context surrounding it. And when something like that happens, in these weird cases where a lot of people end up watching something or consuming something that they shouldn't, then you get products that end up having this sort of lasting cultural memory of not being good, and people won't bring it up as a classic, even though there's lots of things that are super niche Like, let's say the Earthbound games. Like, the average gamer probably would not love the Earthbound games, but the average gamer will never play them. Most of the people who are going to go back and play Earthbound or Mother 3, are people who are going to love those games. And that's why everyone who talks about it absolutely loves it, and it's so critically acclaimed. Whereas other games that maybe could be as acclaimed if they weren't played by this huge contingent of people who wouldn't like it, surely exist out there. Now I bring all this up because the game in this video is Sword of Mana, which is a part of a franchise that was broken off from the Final Fantasy franchise. The original game was Final Fantasy Seiken Densetsu, and that game was so different from Final Fantasy that it probably caused some of these problems I'm talking about, so they split it off and made it its own franchise, the Mana series. And smartly enough, when they did this, they did not make this a numbered series, because even though the Mana games probably have even more in common gameplay-wise than the Final Fantasy games do with one another, they take place in different worlds with different characters. It's tenuous connections between the games, so rather than calling them, Secret of Mana 1, 2, 3, 4, there's the original Seiken Densetsu, which was remade as Sword of Mana on the Game Boy Advance, which is the one you're watching right now. There's Legend of Mana and Secret of Mana. But even still, a lot of the problems I'm talking about kind of arise with this game because it's impossible to discuss this game without it being compared to the other Mana games, which are far, far more popular and beloved than this one. And that's not for bad reason. They're better games, most likely. Sword of Mana is not an incredible game, but it's kind of a shame when you can't really talk about the game at all without inviting that comparison, because maybe some people just want to talk about Sword of Mana, take it on its own merits, and enjoy it as its own game. And where this becomes especially frustrating is for people who maybe didn't get the chance to play the other games, or just had this one. Now for me, as a kid, I was not aware of Secret of Mana or Legend of Mana. I never had a Super Nintendo or a PlayStation 1 at a time when those would have been relevant. I had a Game Boy Advance though, and Legend of Mana, or Sword of Mana rather, was a game that came out for the GBA. I bought it, I played it, and I more or less enjoyed it, though I did not finish the game. And I remember it was one of the few games on the GBA that I dropped and didn't have like a huge intention to finish it. Like, there's plenty of games from back then that I got stuck at some point and I gave up, but I wanted to get back to it over the years. Sword of Mana was one of the few games where I kind of was bored with it when I dropped it. It was a combination of, it wasn't so much like I got stuck and just got frustrated at this one boss. It was more like I got stuck and thought, this isn't that fun anymore. It's a sort of repetitive game. I'm sure I probably fucked up the job system somehow. I'm sure that there were just things I didn't understand about what I was doing, and that probably led it to be, even worse than it would have been, because I'm sure it's a pretty decent game overall. But it's just kind of unfortunate that I never would have had the opportunity to discuss this game with anybody, because if I brought it up, people will just talk about it in terms of how it compares to the other games in the Mana series. And I can't imagine how difficult it must be to just talk about the merits of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, or even like Final Fantasy V, which is a game that's largely beloved by critics, but not a lot of Final Fantasy fans have really played it. So people are just going to talk about it in terms of how it compares to other Final Fantasies. And the only reason this happens is because the name is on it. Ordinarily, people don't take every single game in one genre and constantly compare them. I mean, you will get, any RPG, any big JRPG will probably invite some comparison to Final Fantasy, especially if it's very similar, then it will be. But a game like Crystal Chronicles, if that had come out with no Final Fantasy attached to it, there would have really been no comparison. I mean, what would people have compared that game to? Probably, I don't know. I don't know if anything. I don't know what they would. And there's plenty to criticize about that game on its own merits as well. But I do wonder if maybe the things that were interesting about it kind of got lost to time. And I wonder if that's why we never got a good fix for it. Like, there's never been out of all the sequels to Crystal Chronicles, at least as far as I understand, they took the game in such a different direction that we never really got just the better version of that game. We never got the learned from the mistakes and just corrected those version of that game. Probably because, the conversation wasn't really like that for that game. Well, at this point, I'm going a little bit too far down the hole of talking about Crystal Chronicles and other games, but that's partly because I did not make it very far into Sword of Mana for the sake of this video. Not to say that I think this is a bad game by any stretch, but it's fascinating to think that this game probably would have been best for me at the age when I did play it. Or maybe even just a few years later. Maybe if I had understood the game a little better, I would have enjoyed it even more. But it's not the kind of game I can play now. And the reason I say that is that this is not a game that's good for long, concentrated bursts of playing. Because it is pretty repetitive and very simple, and it's the kind of game that really feels like it's meant to be turned on and played for a little bit and turned off like many other Game Boy Advance games. Now, it has its flaws in trying to be that as well, considering that it opens with a 10-minute unskippable cutscene, and the dialogue is a little slow. It's a little too cutscene heavy for a handheld RPG, but there are save points like all over the place. You know, unfortunately you can't save wherever you want, but there are frequent saves. It's a decent kind of handheld experience. It's the kind of game I probably would have played for an hour, you know, every day, and then eventually made it all the way through. But trying to play it like that today just does not correspond with my lifestyle at all. There's no time in my life where I play handheld games. That's just not a facet of my existence anymore. I don't have any kind of commute. I don't do any public transportation. I don't find myself waiting around in places very often. There's no opportunities for me to play handheld games, really. When I play games, it's usually because I'm sitting at my computer or at my console just playing a game all day. And Sword of Mana is not very conducive to that. It's a little too repetitive. It's a little too bare bones. There's not really a whole lot of depth in the way that you interact with this game on a moment-to-moment level. The storyline is completely cliched. You play as a either girl or boy. I played the girl, and her village is destroyed by the evil government. You don't know who your real mom is. Go find your real mom. Take down the evil. You know, it's a fucking JRPG plot. And while I know that this game is a remake of the older Seiken Densetsu game, and so it maybe didn't try to add too much to the old game. I don't know exactly how much it does add or subtract from it, but for an RPG, it doesn't feel very alive. That opening cutscene, your village gets attacked and all that, and you see that, but you don't actually interact with the village much at all. There's one scene of you talking to your mom, and then like an old guy and a kid, and then a bunch of soldiers show up and they just torch the village. You never even see the whole village. You never really get the chance to interact with people there or to care about them at all. You know, I mean, granted, these are cliche scenarios that if it had happened, I probably would have rolled my eyes either way. But, you know, I remember when I played Xenogears, for instance, and the same thing happens, but it let me run around and talk to people for like a whole hour in the starting town before this huge, you know, this cataclysm happens where everybody gets killed, and I actually kind of cared because I had actually, you know, talked to all these people and had a good sense for what life was like for them before this tragedy strikes. And that's true of most JRPGs. This one, nothing like that. You have a short conversation with your mom, and I will say that some of the dialogue was surprisingly effective, at least. Because when you're about to leave, your character's going to go on a journey, like she was about to go on a journey, but then the village got attacked and she had to go on a journey for sort of different reasons. But she complains to her mother, like, I like everyone in this town. I don't want to go out into the world and, you know, end up meeting people I don't like because I don't want to not like people. And then her mom says, well, you know, liking and hating people is kind of two sides of the same coin. What really matters is that you're feeling something, you're interacting with people and communicating. And she says the line, as long as you feel, that's what matters. And I was like, oh, I do feel, game. You have made me feel. But that kind of felt like a fluke afterwards. I feel like that was just some, you know, it's supposed to be some inspirational dialogue that your mom character is telling you before she gets killed along with everybody else in the village. And while they managed to pull a great little inspiring quote out of that, it is not at all indicative of the overall quality of writing of the game, which is just bog standard. So I found myself with no real interest in the game. And what impacted me the most about that is the idea that, like, this is a drop. And it's a drop that's coming 13 years later, after the first time I played this game. Maybe 12 or 13 years later. And I've had a lot of these experiences as an adult, mostly with video games, where when I was a kid, I really had it in my head that I was going to beat all these games. Like, there was a period when, I'd say about 2004, where I was really obsessed with JRPGs, and I would buy them en masse. I had a ton of these JRPG games, and I sort of, like, had it in my head I would eventually play all of them. And some of them were a little bit out of my depth. Some of them I just didn't play for very long because I tend not to finish things. And going back to them, these games that, like, in my head I always thought, eventually I'm gonna beat these games. Eventually I'll get back to all these and I will beat them. And then I finally play them as an adult and realize that time has passed. That time when I would have cared about these games enough to beat them is gone. And I've had it with a few games, and this is one of them, where, you know, and this is not one I was super attached to as a kid. It's not one where it was like a big deal that I finish it. You know, there's other games from back then that I really, like, had some stake in the idea that one day I would get around to finishing that game, and then I've played it and been like, oh, I don't even like this. That has happened a few times. This one, there was not that high of a stakes in it, but it's on that list. It's on that list of games that, you know, I bought it, I owned it, I had played halfway through it, I thought one day I'll finish this, and now I'm looking at it and going, I'll never finish this. There's probably never going to be a time in my life for a simplistic GBA JRPG. It's just not going to happen. So, yeah, it's dead. And in some ways, that's liberating to have something crossed off the list, you know, to say, well, alright, at least I don't have to worry about that now. When you have as daunting of an on-hold list as I do in every medium, then this can be a liberating thing. And this has happened to me with anime and stuff, too. It's happened to me with everything. Just lots of stuff that's been on hold for so long that, like, it's almost like part of my identity, the idea that I would finish all these things. But it can be nice, especially if I could do this in rapid-fire succession, as I have done sometimes in the past, where I have this huge, daunting list, but then once I start going through it, I realize, oh, I don't even have to do a lot of these, you know? Actually, this list isn't as bad as I thought it was, because most of these are going in the trash, you know? I've just outgrown my need to consume them. How convenient. Yeah, in some ways it's a time saver that I don't have to play Sword of Mana. And, you know, it's funny, I don't think it would have taken much more to this game for it to have hooked me in, but I do think that the reason I'm not going to play it is not even as much to do with the nature of the game as with the idea. It's just not as good as other games that are similar. Like, the visual presentation of this game is excellent. Everything looks really nice. The art style is really cool. I love the pixel graphics. I love the color choices they used. It has this very, you know, fantastical feel to it that it's very homey and nice. But the levels are hallways. Like, you just go through a succession of hallways. The game's pretty weirdly unclear about where you need to go and what you need to do, even though it's so linear. There's a lacking sense of knowing that you've done the right thing. For instance, at one point, in the first village, the village where you practically start playing, you talk to this kid who tells you that he wants you to go find a book out in this meadow. And it just seems like some random kid giving you a side quest. There's a few of these. There's a few people who will tell you, like, oh, bring me some of these and I'll give you some money. And I was like, okay. So I'm thinking that's some side quest. Well, I go out into the field and I get killed. Now, this put me back before I'd talked to the kid. So this time I go out into the field, and I'm exploring, trying to figure out, like, where do I go next, and nothing's happening. I just kind of run in a circle. So I go back to the village, I talk to everybody again, then I go back out into the field, and then when I get to this one screen, a cutscene activates, because it turns out that trying to find this kid's book is actually how you progress the main storyline of the game. It's not a side quest. And that was so, like, weirdly vague. And then it happened to me again when I was, like, you know, progressing to the next stage. I kind of ran through all the available areas and nothing happened. And I thought, well, there must be a cutscene I haven't activated. So it's weirdly unclear. Another thing that's weird is that there's very little interaction with the world. You go into someone's house and there's all this stuff everywhere, all these barrels and papers and all this stuff, but nothing happens when you click on any of it. Now, for me, with the JRPGs, there's a moment very early into every JRPG where I'm going to figure out how into this game I'm going to get. In terms of like exploring, and it's when I click on everything in a house and how much data do I end up gathering from doing so. You know, do I get experience? Do I get like little notes? Do I learn something? That's the kind of thing I love. In Pokemon X and Y, in that game, almost nothing that you clicked on rewarded you. Because in the old Pokemon games, you could sometimes just click on a random trash can and you get a potion, right? So you click on fucking everything. There's even secret stuff that you just like walk down a hallway that appears to be blank, but if you press A at the end of the hallway, there's secretly something there. I love that kind of stuff. In Pokemon X and Y, almost nothing did that. So like after the first town, I just stopped. I stopped trying because I didn't care as much about exploring and taking in all the surroundings. Whereas in Pokemon Sun and Moon, they brought that back. Now, sometimes you'll be in a room where there's like 5 random Pokemon, you know, and when you talk to a Pokemon, it just goes like, brrr. But in that game, sometimes those random Pokemon will just give you items out of nowhere. Sometimes you look in someone's dresser and there's a potion, you know. And that, to me, just rewarding you for getting immersed is really important to me. Like, rewarding the player for their decision to click on absolutely everything in the game. And Sword of Mana has none of that. It has no reward for exploring, and it's linear as hell anyways. So the game looks a lot more detailed than it is. And I'm sure that's probably just because it's a reskin of an old game. You know, it's a game that in the first place was probably a lot more bare bones and simple, but now they've gussied it up without really changing that core mechanical element. So it ends up looking way fancier and deeper than it actually is to play. So all in all, I can't say that I recommend Sword of Mana as a game in 2016 as an adult. Certainly there's so much more that you could have now. You know, at the time that this game came out, at the very least, it would have been on the Game Boy Advance, which was the best looking handheld console. Like, if you were into handheld gaming, the Game Boy Advance was the best handheld there was. It was going to be the best handheld gaming experience. Now, there were other better action RPGs on the console that were, you know, just as nice looking and probably even better to play. But, you know, there's room for a decent one. There's room on the console for there to be an okay action RPG. However, it's not that time anymore. There's a million games with better looking graphics, with the same kind of combat. There's 1,000 fucking mobile consoles, because now your phone is a mobile console. You can download a better action RPG on the App Store than this game now. So I do think that for the time it came out, this would have been an okay game to have as a 13-year-old kid with a GBA in 2004. But I think today, there's just no place for this game. And it's kind of sad. And, you know, it is just because of the Legend of Mana and Secret of Mana that doubles up on this game will never be talked about again. This game is just gonna die. And maybe that's fair. Maybe it's fair to just let it die. But, consider this video to have been a swan song for the deceased.